face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Good evening and welcome to episode 1 of the Policy Dialogue series with alumni, staff, faculty, and students from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. The views expressed do not represent official positions of the school or alumni network. Our goal is to discuss specific policy solutions that can address and solve the current local, national, and international challenges we face. We are recording this on September 24th, 2020. My name is Papp, and I graduated with the class of 2011 with a focus on international security and economic policy. Joining me tonight are fellow alumni, Esther Rodriguez, Delisha Thompson, and Jazz Lewis. How's everyone doing?
Doing well. How are you?
Doing all right.
I am doing excellent and can't wait to get into it.
Great.
Excited.
Great. It's great to see all you here. So before we dive in, I'd like to go around and have you discuss your relation to the School of Public Policy, like when you graduated, what you focused on, what you are currently working on, or what are your current interests. So let's begin with Delisha.
No problem. Well, hi everyone. I'm Delisha Thompson. I graduated from the School of Public Policy in spring 2018. Although I didn't specialize, my coursework concentrated on education and mental health policy. And my capstone specifically focused on post-secondary education and mental health policy solutions. After I graduated, I lived in Taiwan for 2 years and taught at a university there. And currently I'm working with a friend on his NSF grant to get his medical prototype off the ground. And last but not least, I am also preparing for law school so we can put policy into practice.
It's a lot on your plate.
Yeah.
A lot of experience, a lot of perspective. Great to have you, Delisha. Esther, you want to kind of give a go around on what you're up to?
Sure. My name is Esther Rodriguez, and I actually graduated from the School of Public Policy in 2018. I was actually part of the first undergraduate cohort that graduated. Public policy is a fairly new major to the University of Maryland for undergraduate studies. Right after that, I went and pursued a master's at American universities, and I just secured that in May. I have a master's in education policy and leadership. Right after graduation, I worked for an education nonprofit in Washington, D.C. in Ward 5. I was there for about a year, and then the Associate Dean, Dr. Nina Harris, at the School of Public Policy, called me and asked me if I wanted to come join and help recruit. And I didn't give it a second thought. The opportunity to work with my mentors was not an easy one to pass up. And I've now been at the School of Public Policy for going on a year next month. My roles kind of changed. Initially, I started working for undergraduate studies to work on programming and recruitment for the undergraduate program. But since then, I've been brought on for a new initiative that is hopefully going to launch really, really soon. It's a special initiative called Civic Maryland. And the purpose of that initiative is to increase civic education and participation, not just in College Park, but in PG County, in the community, and in Maryland as a whole. And our most important focus points right now are getting that census in, completed, and voting November 3rd.
Great. Thank you so much. And Mr. Lewis, batons to you.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here with Delisha, Esther, and Evan. I graduated in the class of 2014. I focused in federal acquisition and international development. I had my original thought coming to the program is that I was going to see how we can use government contracting in other nations to help with development, particularly in building people's economy and allowing them to be resilient of their own. Upon graduating from the program, I got hired to work for Congressman Steny Hoyer, who's the majority leader of the House of Representatives, originally running his campaign. And doing that, along with the work I did before policy school as a community organizer, just grounded me in issues of criminal justice reform. I'm from Prince George's County, born and raised. So as I was kind of going back into the communities and seeing a lot of the struggles there, I felt like I needed to direct my mind and my intention back home, as well as issues of racial wealth inequality. I currently serve in the Maryland legislature, representing the 24th legislative district as the chair of the House Democratic Caucus, and I pursue a lot of criminal justice reform policies, of course, police accountability, but also things on prison reform that I think we also really need to talk about, from reproductive health issues in prison to issues of mental health and access to appropriate and quality health care in prison that we often don't think about, as well as making sure we're doing all we can to restore people to the communities once they exit the care of the state. Outside of my role in the legislature, I now serve as a senior policy advisor for Congressman Hoyer, working on issues of small business, criminal justice reform, and economic mobility. I've been very happy that during this pandemic, one of the few things I've been able to keep motivated is that I am fighting with a number of change warriors to push things like the CARES Act, to make sure resources are going to folks who need it. So I'll stop there because I think there's a lot I'd like to dive into on how much more I think we need to do, but I'm happy to be here.
Awesome. Great. Very excited to have you all on. So kind of introducing our first episode. Presidential debate between Trump and Biden will be on next Tuesday, September 29th. And Chris Wallace of Fox News will moderate the debate. And according to the Associated Press, the topics will focus on the Trump and Biden records, the Supreme Court, COVID-19, the economy, race and violence in our cities, and the integrity of the election. So tonight, we're going to discuss some of these policies around these topics. So we're going to kick it off. First topic, race and violence in our cities. And I just want to kind of bring up this article because the framing of this topic is problematic. And according to a September 23rd article in the Washington Post, quote, race and violence in our cities suggests that the primary issue surrounding the protests this summer is violence, not justice. And that it is explicitly race-based and urban-centered. It also shifts the focus away from the cause of the protests themselves, the use of deadly force by police against African Americans, and racial inequities in general, unquote. So we're going to broaden this discussion, discuss policies around racial justice, police brutality, and other things. So I'm going to throw it out to y'all. Who would like to go first on this one?
Yeah, I'll definitely kick this one off. What I feel like so many people, when they're having this discussion, they never think about, if you give somebody, I'm from Baltimore, to be clear to the audience. So if you're giving people barely their necessities for survival, like food, water, and shelter, how exactly what do you expect is going to happen? There's few resources, people aren't getting their basic needs met. That creates violence. Every time we've done studies where communities have been specifically provided resources so that those needs are met, the rate of violence goes down. Why? Because people don't have to fight for resources. So I think we need to keep this in mind when we have discussions, when we see protests, that in Baltimore, at the very least, nobody owns anything. In the parts of Baltimore City where you see that happen, they don't. Why would they feel any type of way for something they don't own and can't own because of the structures that are set up? So I think people need to keep in mind that while we don't want to resort to violence to get justice, understand that it is decades of pent up rage and anger and frustration that nobody is listening. And let's be clear, protest, the purpose of protest is to be disruptive. And if people feel like violence is the only, like burning down a store is the only way, I can't really fault them for that, in the sense of they don't see any other option to get any attention on the issue.
Agreed. But I'd go even beyond that. First of all, if my daughter was shot and killed by the police in the middle of the night, and every last one of them got off, I'd be burning it all down too. You better believe I would be. If my son was killed in broad daylight by somebody who's getting paid by my tax dollars, where, you know, you can literally see the life being taken from him on stream, you better believe I'm burning it down, and I'm taking anyone that's in my way. That's just a human response to pain, and to just a very basic, decent respect for human life, right? And Breonna Taylor doesn't have to be my daughter, and George Floyd doesn't have to be my son to understand exactly what's happening out in the streets. One thing that I didn't mention in my intro is when I graduated in 2018, I was 20 years senior, my cohort. You know, I am originally from Washington, D.C., born and bred. I am in Maryland because gentrification pushed me out. Great state, but it will never, ever be the city. But I lived through, you know, Rodney King. I lived through riots in Mount Pleasant when actually then I believe it was a female Black officer killed a Latino on Mount Pleasant Street, which in that time was predominantly Hispanic, and they took to the streets. You know, anybody that continues to focus on buildings and drywall, and I say that fully aware that I understand that a lot of these businesses represent people's livelihoods, small businesses in particular, represent people's livelihoods. It oftentimes provides jobs for you know, their employees, for the community. They're providing needs and services. I get that. But at what point, you know, is enough enough? And we can dispute this, but the reality is this country has historically acted once we've gotten fed up and fought back. I mean, if you can look at every historical piece of legislation that's passed that has influenced civil rights, not a single one has gone without violence in the street. And I'm not saying that this is the means to an end, but at what point? You know, one thing that I hear a lot is, you know, not all police officers are bad. The majority are good. I used to say that myself. I don't believe it anymore. I don't believe it anymore. I'm not saying that there aren't very good police officers, but I will say that even if you get in with the best intentions possible, something happens to them when they're in that position. And it's got to give. You know, now I'm one of those dismantle the police. I honestly think that we should dismantle law enforcement and start all over again, because these systems were created during a time where Delisha was not a person. Jazz Lewis was, you know, counted as half a human, third of a human or whatever, you know, like these systems were not built to protect Black people. And until that system gets, and that's why I say not reformed, screw reform. This has been argued over and over again. Until it is dismantled and started from the bottom up, this is never going to stop.
So
if I can.
I want Jazz to come in, and then I do want us to also talk about some of the solutions as well, because I think we all agree it's a pretty effed up situation as well, and how we need to, what do we need to change ultimately? So adding Mr. Jazz, please.
Yeah. So I second and third everything that both Delisha and Esther have said. We know that policing started with slave catchers in America. We know that is the original policing in America was focused on capturing property, and Black people were property at the time, right? The same way if someone broke into your house and took your TV, you wanted your TV back, and you would call the police to report that. That is the exact same way policing started, but focused on policing Black bodies. And there hasn't been a lot of change since those codes in the early 1800s. And what I mean by that is oftentimes as folks of color start to announce their presence either through housing or through entering in schools, the initial response from communities is to call the police to be the enforcer of what we think is appropriate within this social construct that we call society, right? So in some ways, I pity the police because they get the brunt of the policy. They get the brunt of the blame for things that society as a whole has allowed to happen. They are the enforcer for the values we claim, okay? So when we allow certain communities to be over-policed, it's because we put policies in place to require them to do so, okay? When police aren't held accountable for their actions, it's because as a society then, we essentially value that level of violence perpetrated against the communities that is being perpetrated against. And they are the enforcers, that's their job, but they don't decide the policy, which creates an interesting point when people talk about well, are there good police, are there bad police? I think that's not even the real question. I think the real question is like, you know, do we have a rotten system or not? And I think the answer to that is yes, the system is rotten. I've talked to so many police officers, both as a legislator, but just in like regular life, who told me to my face that, you know, I would report things that I've seen other officers do, but all of our entire HR process for accountability, internal affairs, is all internal, okay? And then oftentimes you get looked over for promotions and the like if you essentially snitch on another officer, you know? So I think as we hop back and forth between the problems and solutions, I think one clear solution is that police are not capable of self-policing. We don't allow most professions to self-police anyway. As an elected official, we do not self-police. We have a state prosecutor who reviews us all the time. Anyone can file a complaint against us and they review that. We have no agency over that process. I think that in and of itself will help officers start to make one another accountable because they will go to this independent party who can then hold them accountable instead of worrying about retribution within the department. That's one part, okay? I'm from Prince George's County, born and raised. I remember the stories of Prince Jones. He's a 25-year-old who was a Howard University student who was driving through Prince George's County and was murdered. Many folks may know him now because Ta-Nehisi Coates was a friend of his and references him in his book, Between the World and Me. But for me as a resident, as a young boy, that stuck with me. Same as Freddie Gray stuck with me. Now I'll tell you, I think to Delisha's point earlier, and Esther kind of stepped in that with the gentrification piece. If we want to have a conversation about these cycles of, you know, race and violence and whatnot, you can feel it coming. When I was a community organizer in Baltimore, and I would be knocking in communities to try to find the elders to organize for change, I would see all these young people just kind of like hanging around. And they weren't loitering. They lived in these communities, but they had nothing to do. And why didn't they have anything to do? Well, it's because, you know, 2 out of every 3 young Black males in Baltimore City have some form of a record. And because they have a record in this red herring, they can't get gainful employment. They can't get a lot of government benefits and the like, right? So there's this energy that's building, this frustration because, you know, society has targeted them. They're not giving them the resources that they need. And then lo and behold, now officers break the back of someone named Freddie Gray, okay? And all that frustration just cracks, you know? But it didn't start with the murder of Freddie Gray. It's like a valve that's just been building pressure. And that's what called the snap, same as George Floyd, same as Breonna Taylor. And it's not new. I mean, it's comparable to, you know, I think of Emmett Till, you know, and how the murder of Emmett Till in a lot of ways really launched the civil rights movement in the 50s. That I think first, it's just good to put things in context that, you know, this isn't something that's just happened now. This isn't just because of Donald Trump either. I want to be clear, you know, when I was a community organizer in 2010 through like 13, you know, he wasn't in office, okay? And these same policies needed to be addressed. So I'll stop there so I'm not hogging the mic.
Yeah, and I really think the intersection between class and race is especially relevant in the United States because of our history. I mean, the class system in England, for instance, they break people up from, you know, different inflection points on where they come from, the different parts of whether you're Scottish, Wales, or Irish, and things like that. Race and class here, they're intertwined in so many ways, and even the union movements would prevent certain races from joining, and that's also what happened, to pit poor white workers against, you know, poor or enslaved or even freed black workers against each other after the Emancipation Proclamation. So I really appreciate kind of the material aspect of looking at this question. I mean, some of the things that I think about on the policy side is like, yeah, obviously qualified immunity is insane because you have one officer who may resent the fact that the person he's working with is committing crimes, but they can't really, they don't talk about it. Aren't going to be actually investigated on it. The self-policing of themselves is also another huge problem. Having a working Department of Justice, the Department of Justice was created by Ulysses S. Grant as a way to try to fight the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and the fascism at that time that was attacking the freed black slaves, that were creating militias and things like that, and were actually gaining on political power in places like Texas and Virginia at that time. So having a working DOJ, Department of Justice, that actually tracks these police departments with databases that can go in and reshape them, hire, those type of things, licensing the police officers. And then I think a huge part is economic investment, jobs, education, housing. But I'm going to turn it back over on Delisha, if you want to jump back in, or others folks.
Yeah, just because, you know, my background is in mental health, I just want to speak to that a little bit. So there's this concept in psychology called transgenerational trauma, meaning that from slavery to present, African Americans have passed down, not on a genetic level, so these changes aren't happening in the DNA. They're more like, you know how you can turn a light switch on and off? They're triggers that can onset an issue later, which is why the African American community has extremely high rates of depression and anxiety. We go undiagnosed because we can't afford to go get diagnosed for those things. And I want you to imagine how traumatized you are from seeing repeated violence in your neighborhood. It's almost as if you are completely desensitized to violence. So I need our audience to understand that when the powder keg blows, like, it's just because, like, the desensitization has been turned off and it cannot linger in that way. It is almost as if it's a safety mechanism to protect us from, like, really seeping and thinking about how many people have been murdered. And in Baltimore City in particular, there's a survey called the ACEs survey. And it's basically, it measures how many traumatic events has happened in a child's life before the age of 8. And in Baltimore City, the overwhelming majority of children by the age of 5 have seen 3 traumatic events in their life. When you see a traumatic event as a child, that changes the structures of the brain, like physically changes them, because the child needs to now adapt to trauma. They're in a trauma-filled environment, which means their brain needs to adapt and cope within that environment. So I think that it would be helpful if, along with policy solutions, there just needs to be trust rebuilt. The anxiety of not knowing if an officer is having a good day and, will let you act normal and will have a, normal interaction, that is too much. I think the police do need to do a better job of reaching back out into the community and rebuilding that trust, because it is non-existent. I agree with what everyone has said so far, particularly about qualified immunity. That's just absolutely ridiculous. But I also think it's not even just the police. You have to change the minds of Americans, because most of these cases go before a grand jury first. And the vast, overwhelming majority of Americans, if you ask them, do you lean towards believing officers just generally, like no matter what, the overwhelming majority of Americans believe police, like instinctively, because we've mythologized them in certain communities. In minority communities, we know exactly what's going down. In other communities, they're using it as a protection, as a state-enforced protection mechanism. So until we as Americans can come together and acknowledge that we can live in 2 different worlds and both realities can exist at the same time, I'm not sure if reform in the police is enough. Because if they're going to go the grand jury route, you also need to have a slow change in how people they need to view the police as human beings who can make mistakes and not mythologize them to the point that they're blinded and won't acknowledge the mistakes are happening.
Just to quickly interject,
I just wanted to add that to the comment. Yes.
On the whole Breonna Taylor thing too, this no-knock warrant, this idea, and the drug war, you got rich people can take any drug they want and get away with it. And you got poor people who are attacked on it. And there's plenty of information that anyone can look at. Where's the prosecutor who and the judge who gave this warrant? And a no-knock warrant in the middle of the night, a person's walking their car, you can just mob someone and detain them and then arrest them and go through that process. You don't have to do a no-knock warrant on a non-violent drug vendor. Turned out no drugs, no record. The boyfriend is legally owning a firearm, concealed carry, and it's just insane. It's absolutely insane. So
yeah, and the fact that go ahead, Esther. Go ahead. My thing with that is, so I can't, forgive me for not knowing the guy who made the announcements of the charges is, forgive me for not knowing his name. But for him to get up in front of a crowd and say, there was never a no-knock warrant. That wasn't a thing that happened. When in the news up to point, it was acknowledged that there was probably a no-knock warrant. It is like, it is being lied to. Like, how do we have images from the police reports which say basically nothing? And yet you're going to come out and tell us that, oh no, the police had explicitly said exactly what happened from beginning of the interaction to the end of the interaction. It's even more infuriating. It creates even more violence when it's just a blatant lie. I would rather them get up there and be like, we don't care about her life. It's whatever. Sorry, there's going to be no charges. And then leave the stage instead of just lying and being like, our officers were justified from beginning to end. How? You went to the wrong house. You executed a no-knock warrant and now you're claiming we didn't. It's just, well, so as someone who lived in Taiwan, let me explain something to you for the audience really quick. In Taiwan, you have to account for the bullets that an officer shoots. If you started the day with 30 bullets And at the end of the day, you have 28. You better be able to tell somebody how that happened. They like track it ridiculously because the incentive is to de-escalate and not fire a weapon. So many situations just need de-escalation. There are situations where force is necessary, but the overwhelming majority, you can have a conversation and the potentiality for violence can go down. So I hope that, I know in Louisiana, in that county, they've been like, all right, we won't do no-knock warrants anymore. I think that needs to be a nationwide thing. They claim it's because of the drug war, and I'm just like, no, just get rid of all no-knock warrants. That's just a recipe for disaster, especially for in over-policed neighborhoods. I could go on and on, but I could tell Esther, she wants to get in on this, so I'm going to let her talk.
Well, no. So I think the biggest problem, right, is all the misinformation that has been perpetuated, right, about this this really screwed up, I mean, because there's no other way to put it, right, drug bust. And my understanding is that it wasn't a no-knock warrant. My understanding is that the judge changed it to a knock warning hours before. My understanding is that they had been surveilling Breonna Taylor because of her ex-boyfriend's involvement. But if they were truly surveying her well, or actually the ex-boyfriend, they would know that she had not seen him for some time. They would know that he was no longer interacting, doing his business, I guess, or whatever, out of her home. They would have known that there was another man in that house. I listened to a reporter that covered this story really in depth, and it included a lot of the boyfriend's account. And, he says that they didn't hear them. They didn't announce themselves, but what they did hear was it was a loud bang. People were knocking at the door. So their instinct was, it's the ex-boyfriend. So when they bust through the door, he grabs his gun because, he's licensed and legally up, can protect himself and his home.
Where's the NRA, right?
I'm sorry?
Where's the NRA to defend him, right?
Where were they for Philando Castile? But I digress. He shot once, and then he recluded, and then not only that, like, they didn't even know he was in there. They didn't even, because he had gotten himself, I guess, into a hiding place or whatever. And he actually called the police. He had called 911 while all this was happening. Because, again, he thought that there was an intruder that had killed his girlfriend, and he thought it was the drug-dealing ex-boyfriend. And then that's when the police started to announce, who's in there or something to that effect. And people keep saying that she was asleep, that she was murdered in her sleep. She really wasn't. She was petrified. She had gotten up. She was right behind him. And she also thought she was going to die that day. She was right. But she thought her ex-boyfriend was going to kill her. There's a lot of people that say, were their neighbors listen, they didn't listen. I don't know. But the point is that I'm trying to say out of all this is that, there's a lot of narratives that are getting pushed out. But what frustrates me the most is, she was a drug dealer. Okay. She wasn't, but let's just say she was. You know what I'm saying? Like, at what point are we going to actually value life and say, one, last I heard, no one's guilty until they're proven guilty. And two, you should not be going into a home, guns blazing. And then three, completely discredit her life because, she's a drug dealer. If there's one thing that I learned actually at the School of Public Policy that I think is probably the most important thing as a policymaker, I'm not, that's just jazz in the room, but, it's all about how things get framed, right? And when you hear people that are, Blue Lives Matter or All Lives Matter, it's almost like character assassination is the first mechanism completely dismiss their value. And I just don't understand how we can get past this. Like, we've literally created a society where you trust the police and whatever they say, you believe, but then you talk about, they get 6 months, a year of training, they're not vetted the way they should be. I mean, I have a brother who at one point worked for the Department of Labor, and when he was getting the job, I think they knocked on everyone and their mother, like all of our neighbors, ex-girlfriends, because he was going to have access to information. Okay, that's it, because he's an economist, boring as hell. But they wanted to know, was he going to be trustworthy with that information? Yet we will give someone a gun and the right to take away life and liberty. No questions asked. I mean, let's analyze this without knowing who they were. Where did they grow up? What did they do? We need to know more about people that are protecting our neighborhoods.
So,
yes, please.
I first like to say, my mother is retired law enforcement, right? I value the people who serve in law enforcement. I really do, because I remember a time where, as a kid, my siblings and I, my mom had saved some money and took us to the circus in DC. I think the Ringling Brothers was in town, and we were all excited, and we had just got our popcorn and sat.
Hey.
I know, not anymore. But we go to the Soul Circus now, so as long as it's still here. But we would do that, right? And then as soon as we sat down, I think it was called NCI Center at the time. This is years ago. I'm dating myself. But as soon as we sat down, my mother got a call that they had that she needed to go to some operation that they were running. And she drove us back home, dropped us off, put us to bed, and drove, and I didn't see her for another day. Really, really concerned. So it's I get the concern that folks have over the safety of law enforcement. With that said, though, when you check the data, there's and this is a thing also I really appreciate about the policy school, because there's always some part of you that's itching to find out if there's any ready available data, right? So I'll do a couple things. Dr. Sean Ray, who's a sociologist at the University of Maryland, has done a study with the Prince George's County Police Department and other police departments to try to build empathy, and they go through all these different techniques to do so. One of the things that they do when they measure is officers' propensity to shoot or not shoot, okay? And these are supposed to be trained professionals in law enforcement, right? Over 50% of the officers who shot when they weren't supposed to shoot in these trainings were officers who were pulling a double or triple shift the night before, right? So you have some inclination, I think, to Delisha's point, not just of their mental health, but their physical health, okay? These folks are tired. No matter whatever training you gave them, they're reverting to their priors, okay? Because they aren't rested. And why aren't they properly rested? Well, they're working overtime or triple time because we don't pay our officers enough, which is a fact, right? So now you have all these folks in the field who, one, the training isn't good enough to begin with, but even beyond that, they're physically and mentally tired, so they're not capable of responding to their best way. So that's something we can do right there. Just like we generally say we should pay our public servants better, we should do the same for them and expect more of them as just a general rule. On this issue of no-knock warrants, one of the big issues we found in a lot of case studies on no-knock warrants and the use of them is that oftentimes when officers they'll reach out to a prosecutor, go before a judge to get a no-knock warrant, they have circumstantial evidence at best, right? So what does that mean? They usually reach out to somebody who is a witness for them, okay, who they usually have some other case with, and they're trying to get their charges better or lowered or something else. Or oftentimes, they're looking for a cash payment or things of that nature. They will say, hey, I saw this person here, okay? one thing that a number of judges have said that, and this is in case law, that can improve the process so that you have less instances like Breonna Taylor, is just to make sure that the police themselves are the eyewitness. Before you ask for any type of knock warrant, you yourself make sure that you eyeball that somebody is where you claim they are, as opposed to relying on someone else's advice without doing your due diligence. Because I think to the facts in the case of Breonna Taylor, there's no reason why that should have gone the way it did if people were doing their jobs adequately. There's so many things, like I don't whether you reform the police, you defund the police, you abolish the police, I don't really get into the back and forth on it, but I do think we have to sever like the idea we had of policing prior to this moment for whatever we think needs to happen moving forward, right? So I remember about a month ago, maybe 2 months ago, there was a story in the news of a man who's intoxicated. He fell asleep in his car, I think outside of a Wendy's or something like that. I don't know if you all remember that story, and ended up getting shot by a police officer because someone called because the guy was just intoxicated. They didn't call because they felt threatened or anything like that. But for our 911 calls, who's the people who respond? So like we should be diverting some of these calls to the appropriate body who should be handling it, whether that's a substance abuse counselor or someone with mental health training. One of the things that we're talking about in the legislature, and some of my colleagues in other states are also talking about, is seeing if we can deploy law enforcement with mental health professionals. If there's some concern that we started to hear from some mental health professionals of responding to scenes without having law enforcement there, because you never know what can happen sometimes in an incident. Like whatever that is, I do think it is severing from the old for what is the new, because the old is grounded in maintaining property. That's just the root. So long as you continue, from that root, you just have to sever it and move forward if we're ever going to be able to talk about building community, which I think is the goal. And I also think that's being missed in here, and like Esther brought this up earlier on, is housing policy, right? So like police are overrepresented in places that are oversaturated with poverty, right? Our housing policy was created by both the federal government and local government, through zoning laws and things of that nature. And I think if we really want to have a conversation about improving policing and improving communities, we also need to talk about housing policy and making sure we have inclusionary zoning, so you don't have situations where all the college educated folks live in one place, okay, and the non-college educated folks or people who haven't graduated high school all live in another place, and all the opportunity is over here and all the lack of opportunity is over here, and then you wonder what's going to happen, So there's so much we have to do.
Jazz, that story about Wendy's, the gentleman at Wendy's, the reason why they called the cops, and it was, I actually heard the 911 call, it was the Wendy's cashier that called the cops because he had fallen asleep in the drive-thru. So he was obstructing the drive-thru, but the 911 call, the operator asked him, is he dangerous? Is he doing this? And she was like, no, he looks like he's just fallen asleep. Like she just needed someone to
move the car out the way.
Basically, and it's not something that they could do because it's a graveyard shift in a drive-thru, and they don't have a lot of people in the working at that time. And it took I think 25 minutes to 30 minutes for that to happen. It was a really bad situation, and they just lost control of it. But I was going to say, and just kind of starting even beyond the housing policy, I think the reality is, and when people don't understand what systemic oppression means and what systemic racism mean, a Black child's life, the difficulty of its life begins at conception. When a Black mother has, is 3 times as likely to die during childbirth than I would, right there. People have to understand what that means,
Yeah, and I would add on to that audience. We do control for income. So this is true despite if you are mid to upper middle class and up, if you are a Black woman. It doesn't matter. a Black woman with advanced degrees is still 3 to 5 times more likely to die giving birth than, say, a white woman who has not graduated high school yet. So I feel like the difficulties of having that conversation is just that a lot of people haven't done the research or the work to see how all of these systems are interconnected in such a way that it's a test for survival, as Esther said, from start to finish. It is horrific that the Baltimore City government can calculate the probability of death in a neighborhood. So, for example, if you live like near East Chase Street, if people know where that is, your lifespan, the probability of preventable death is in the 70% range. Like 70% of deaths are preventable, and they can calculate it. That is insane to me that we can do that neighborhood by neighborhood. And yet, I just think we just don't have the resources, or the resources aren't being put to tackle these things simultaneously. And I also think policy-wise, housing is healthcare, period. So I do think professionals, we need to come out from our little silos and realize that all of our issues are intertwined together. And if we help someone in this area, it can help someone in another area. So I just want to end on that. Sorry, Esther, I cut you off.
That's okay.
That's actually a perfect segue to go into the next topic of the economy, which I really think we need to focus on the material conditions. And the stock market is not necessarily, or is not related to most people's material conditions. Let's be honest about that. So according to a new RAND study, if income had been distributed as evenly over the past 5 decades as it was in 1970, the median full-time worker in the US would now take home $92,000 a year instead of $50,000 a year. And I follow this guy, John Williams of Shadow Stats. He's been around for about 30, 40 years. He's a little too libertarian for my taste, but he does run a very interesting unemployment number. And according to his number, August 2020, unemployment in this country was around 28%, or almost 1 out of 3 workers. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has changed from measuring unemployment and we currently use a U3 number. They have a U6 number, which is their broadest measurement of unemployment. But in 1994, they removed long-term discouraged workers from the unemployment roll. So anyone who's off unemployment assistance, which usually only lasts 26 weeks, someone who's part-time, who wants full-time but can't get a full-time job, these people are not counted as unemployed or underemployed. And then meanwhile, Bloomberg News estimates that the government bailouts could total $8.5 trillion thus far, which is about 60% of the GDP. $5.5 trillion of that comes from the Federal Reserve to banks, which we're not normally talking about. The media generally focuses on the fiscal policies of Congress, but the Federal Reserve has put out 5 times more money to the banks to try to capitalize the banks. Over $1 trillion comes from Treasury, and the rest comes from the FDIC for banking issues and FHA for housing issues. So to throw it out to everyone, how's the economy working for everyone? What are people seeing?
That's a great point. I mean, I usually approach this issue from the position of small women and minority-owned business owners, and I'll say to you, it's not working well for them. I mean, we put together the payroll protection program in the CARES Act with the hope of keeping Main Street alive, and it was an imperfect bill, that was passed in April. That was bipartisan. We wanted to give more specific language, hopeful that the banks and financial institutions would do the right thing, and they didn't. They took care of their largest businesses. I should say their largest business on the small business scale, right? And what does that mean? Well, if you have 500 employees or less. Within the state of Maryland, if you have 500 employees, we do not consider you a small business, but the federal government through the SBA considers you a small business. And they made a rule where it could be up to 500 employees per location, which essentially means it's not small businesses at all, right? And that's why you ended up with places like Shake Shack and other places who were able to benefit from this as opposed to the mom and pop shops. I do think we need to do a whole lot more to drive resources, particularly from the traditional banks to our community development financial institutions that are more focused on interventions within everyday communities, be them rural, be them urban, be them suburban, whatever. Our minority depository institutions, our credit unions in particular, they tend to be more the lifeblood of small businesses in everyday communities. And you know that when a small business owner gets started, when a small business starts, they're more likely to employ the people they know and pay them fair wages to compete with the bigger folks, right? So like as you help small businesses grow, you're actually lifting wages and you're helping to build wealth more broadly than concentrating it. So I'll stop there, but I think we should refocus the conversation often from these, what are these big banks that are too big now to a lot of these smaller, broader institutions that are doing so much with so little.
I don't know, Evan, when you asked that question, if you meant it like personally speaking, but myself right now, I make less and I have less job security with a bachelor's in public policy and a master's in education policy than I did with no degree in the financial district. And it's a tough pill to swallow, because for me to go back to school, for example, when I started at Maryland, my son was 1 and my oldest daughter was, I think, 15, 16 at that point. And I had 4 total. I quit my career to pursue this degree. So, economy's not working great for me, but to be honest, it's never really worked well for me. I hear so much weight put on the economy, which means the stock market, and everybody doesn't have stocks. I don't have stocks. Like, you know what I'm saying? Most of the people in my old neighborhood in Petworth, DC don't have stocks. Well, they might now because income brackets changed quite a bit since my mom bought the house in the 80s. But like, it's just such a, I think it's such a disconnect, and it's funny that you mentioned like the 70s, right? As, those were the good times, right? What's happened since then? Like, let's think about policies. What's happened since then? How much were those really wealthy people paying in taxes in the 70s, right? What happened in the 80s with Reaganomics? And these people that live now in these depressed areas, and now I'm not talking about Black and brown people. I'm talking about white people in the middle of the country, white people in West Virginia that, lived in areas that were booming in their moments. And when I say booming, I literally mean like the American dream, as in well-paid job, kids going to a good school. You know what I'm saying? They have a little bit of retirement, their job security because of a union, like just a normal life, right? It's completely depressed now because so many of those jobs went overseas or just don't exist anymore, So now they're blaming or trying to find blame on someone else when they really just need to be able to look at their legislators and say, what are you doing for me? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, if Jeff Bezos all of a sudden spent or was charged 70% of his top whatever tier of whatever he earns every year, it wouldn't affect his quality of life at all, but it would hugely impact, right, where he lives, where he owns property, and it would hugely impact in terms of taxes and its output right into the community, right? So we need to stop thinking, and now I might be overly speaking, but like for me, taxes don't scare me. And maybe it's because I grew up poor, but taxes, as far as I'm concerned, is my civic responsibility. And if you're making a lot more, then yes, you should absolutely be paying more. Because last I saw, I live in Germantown and I have paved roads and I have crosswalks, that work. I have schools, that are open and everyone that lives in the neighborhood can get into that school. You have to be able to put out to be able to give, right? I mean, to be able to get. And we need to stop looking at other citizens and saying they're taking from me, and start making your legislators really responsible for what's happening in your community and your society. But I mean, without a doubt, that taxing the wealthy has literally killed the middle class in the past 3 decades.
Yeah, I would add on to that the psychology of how people view the rich based on race is very interesting. Because one reason I think it's a little difficult to tax the rich is we've mythologized them to the point that that's the American dream. Jeff Bezos is there because he worked so hard, and if you're not working hard, you don't deserve money. That is at the core of the cultural lexicon that we live in. Is people believe deeply, a lot of people believe deeply, that if you just work hard, then you'll generate your own wealth, however much that is. And that's just not true. It's almost never been true, depending where you live, that working hard will lift you out of poverty. The thing that lifts out people from poverty the most is education. And how do we fund education? Housing taxes. If you live in a terrible neighborhood, how are you people don't own the property, how are the schools going to be good? They won't. Adding on top of that, the government has cut from social services literally every single year for the past few decades. One of the things that COVID has done is shown the fragility of the American system and how much these systems rely on one another to function. And I think the economy, I think people underestimated just how much one sector going down impacted every sector in ways that weren't imagined at the time. For me and other policymakers, you could see the writing on the wall. Like right now, we are probably going to have a housing crisis on the horizon. If it's not happening right now, it's going to happen really soon because people can't afford rent. And then where are they going to go? What are they going to do? If the government doesn't get on that immediately, we are going to have a worse housing crisis than we did in 2008 and 2009. Easily.
Not to go back to policing, but just for 1 second. New York City Police Department's annual budget is $6 billion. If New York City invested that in their schools, they wouldn't need police or correctional facilities in one generation. $6 billion. I mean, can someone try and wrap their head around that? And then the citizens of New York City will get upset because of riots, but then they don't research how much the city pays out to, for payouts to pay for, for bad behavior, for, you guys are nodding with me, so fill in my blank because my head just went blank. But
you need to pay out to such individuals as Breonna Taylor's family. They won the highest settlement, $12 billion. That's taxpayer money. The government cannot afford to pay that. So we, as I don't understand why taxpayers are not incensed by how much they are put on the hook. Not even just for payouts to families, pursuing civil suits, but just generally. When, the government doesn't feel like they want to pay for something or literally cannot afford to pay for it, we as the taxpayers get shafted. And unfortunately, if we have a housing crisis, we're going to have a healthcare crisis. I mean, we already have abysmal healthcare. And I'm saying that as someone who's lived in other countries. So I can tell you right now that the US has a long way to go before it can compete with other developed countries' healthcare. But if people don't have homes, like even before COVID in California, the 30% of America's homeless population lives in California, and that was declared a public health crisis simply because there was a rise in communicable diseases. And so for me, it's frustrating listening to the news and not hearing people connecting all these dots together and not realizing that, hey, if people don't have housing, we're going to add on to a pandemic with additional healthcare crises. The United States does not do enough preventative measures. I think that's at the core of the problem. We mythologize things to a certain point that we just, like, too big to fail as a phrase is ridiculous.
Yeah, and that was Eric Holder, saying that. And to talk about policing, I'm actually pro IRS policing of tax evasion. The entire investigative unit of wealth tax evasion, of high wealth tax evasion, been gutted over the last 20, 30 years. I think it's important also to acknowledge that during the so-called golden era of capitalism in the 1950s in the United States, we had progressive taxation on the highest earners up to 90%. And we were very stable. And there is a one-to-one correlation that you can see these charts where with the unionization going down and that wealth inequality going up. It's literally one-to-one from the 1970s. I think it's important to have a couple concepts on taxation. For instance, there's the regressive taxation, which is a value-added tax, gas tax, those type of things that are more on the consumer, that can affect people who are buying necessities and the amenities of the middle class, necessities of the poor, but doesn't affect the luxuries of the rich class. That's a regressive tax. We want a progressive tax, and we want to avoid that poll tax or that flat tax where everyone pays the same as well. That's kind of some of the things I'm another part of it, concepts, in the policy side is that we oftentimes play in the field of fiscal policy where it's taxes in, taxes out. And it's like, okay, we don't have enough money. The Federal Reserve is playing on a monetary policy where they create money and they issue credit and it goes to the banks and it recapitalizes the banks. There's this third concept, a Hamiltonian concept that was used with the greenbacks with Hamilton. It was used in the New Deal. It's this credit system concept where you, instead of just using a monetary policy to inflate these bankrupt banks to keep them from going bankrupt, you actually move that credit into the productive economy to rebuild the entire infrastructure. So the American Society for Civil Engineers, we have a $4.5 trillion deficit right now on our infrastructure just to get it up to working level. We're a D+ right now. 4.5 trillion. We've just spent 7 trillion recapitalizing the banks. That doesn't go anywhere. If we put that 7 trillion into our economy, into actual physical economy, put it to the states, put it to actual jobs, we could put 40 million people back to work with union wages, and that's and create a new public works administration that rebuilds the infrastructure. Our municipal drinking water systems now all have arsenic problems. They all need to be rebuilt. All our roads, everything needs to get rebuilt here. We need free internet for everyone. This is going to cost money, but it can also create jobs, and it's an investment. And so right now, everyone's also going to talk about debt. So the next person who comes in, if Biden comes in, it's going to be, we need austerity. We need to cut services. That never works. That always contracts the economy. What you need to do is grow the economy so that the economy is so much bigger than the current debt that we have.
Get the math, Evan?
Yeah, I mean, this is
all that math down.
we got to be talking this way. So anyway, I'm sorry I get on my soapbox.
No, I completely agree. It's frustrating how much social programs, education are getting, shafted by just bigger and bigger cuts. Every time we make an economic mistake and these lowered taxes, magically somehow when you lower taxes, apparently you get less taxes. Who knew? So then they have to cut money somewhere else. So if you do look at any study of GDP, the more educated your population is, the more people are above, the poverty line, the more your economy is going to grow, period. And so for me, the United States, one of the things that's interesting about behavioral economics is I think that we as a society need to commit that we are going to suffer in the short term so that we can invest and receive long-term benefits. Unfortunately, when you test people and you ask them those types of questions, they do not want to suffer in the short term to see gains in the long term. And that's even split up by class. So I think that if you want buy-in and you want, a grassroots movement to really pressure legislators to go down that road of progressive taxes and investment into the physical economy or just building up the middle class in general, you're gonna need to convince people that, like basically during World War II, we're not gonna have enough vegetables. Everybody needs to step up to the plate. You might need to make a vegetable garden. Let's make community gardens. Like it might need to be like that, where we're like, American people, you're gonna need to suffer this long for this much, but if you do that, we'll be over here. And I think that if you can do that, we will be so much better off, a generation down the road. And that's unfortunately you have to tell people it's going to take an entire generation to fix a problem, the systemic problems that we have. And it's unfortunate that we can't get as much buy-in for that as we should.
Right. But I'll say this. Until this country deals with race, I don't see how we can achieve, economic stability and let's grow our economy and, forget healthcare. I mean, it's just such a huge issue, right? And again, I go back to the framework, right? Because, when the pandemic hit and everyone kind of had to isolate, it was really hard for my mom to stay in. And I understand that most people, want to have some sort of a normal life, right? But my mom's Puerto Rican. We never had money. We struggled a lot. She was a single mom. And she hustled all her life, right? And she put herself in unsafe situations all the time to be able to provide for her family. She did, when she'd stand at a bus stop at 4:00 in the morning in DC, in the middle of the 90s, when DC was the murder capital of the world, she was exposing herself, and it got me to thinking, when it comes to trauma, just like Delisha talked about at the very onset of our conversation, Black, and I'm going to also add Hispanic people, right? Especially like first generation immigrants that come to this country. They live in trauma from conception. They do. So they don't stop when there's this traumatic event happening. Why? Because we just push through it. We just push through it. That's what we do. And that's in every facet of life, right? And you're taught to ignore what other people say about you. You're taught, I'm assuming, dare I assume, Jazz, Delisha, your parents probably had conversations with you when you guys were younger, about how people would perceive you when you go to the store. I remember the first time I shoplifted, I was maybe 4 or 5. I was at the Giant, and I got all the way home, and I had a ring pop in my pocket. And my Nana made us walk back, and she was like, tell the man what you did, but she had no fear of the manager of the store, reaming me or, calling the police or anything like that, and those are real worries for Black parents. And I had hinted also, didn't hint, but I had described that my first job out of undergrad was I worked at an educational and athletic after-school program It was an educational space, but it was in Ward 5, and it was embedded in a housing community where the average family made $12,000 a year. $12,000 a year in Washington, D.C. in 2019. I mean, can we give that some thought, right? And not generalizing, but, you know, when a white person is down on their luck, they're down on their luck. You know, they've done everything that they can. They tried hard, you know, again, just kind of referencing West Virginia and those affected by, you know, the loss of jobs, right? And it's, you know, now they have these high rates of opioid, right? Addiction and death as a result, right? Overdoses, a lot of suicide too. Like, how would I sound if I said, well, I'm sorry, but you're just gonna have to pull yourself up over your bootstraps and figure it out. Go get yourself another job. Go get yourself some more skills. It would sound really harsh, but that is the reality for what is told to Black and brown communities day in and day out. Day in and day out. Pull yourself up from your bootstraps, you know? And you think about, again, systemic issues, you know, high incarceration of Black men. And then as soon as they get out, the system has put them in a place where they no longer have access to any sort of social programs. So how are you supposed to pay rent if you don't have a job? Now you're on a list because you have a record. You can't go to school because when I applied for FAFSA, I was asked if I had any sort of a criminal record. I'm going to assume that had I said yes, that might have been a stop for me in terms of being able to finance my education. You know, like, what are we doing to this group of people? How are they supposed to pull themselves up from their bootstraps and, you know, start a new life? And let's not even go into the details of people just have this general expectation that any person that's been in jail is a criminal, like a murderer or a rapist. No, a lot of them just can't pay fines because they're so freaking insanely priced, you know? And it's all about how you frame this. Now, you talk to white people that might look at, you know, the ones that'll say, oh, well, you know, she was a drug dealer. Breonna was a drug dealer, you know? No. Like, your son that just overdosed from opioid or who was selling opioids, is he just a drug dealer? You know, it's like the loss of humanity to me is just insane. And granted, I understand that I am empathetic literally to a fault. Like it's detrimental when I'm losing sleep over what's happening in other parts of the country and in the world. But like, we need to have a really open and honest conversation, right? About race. You know, for a long time, I consider myself, I identify very, very strongly Latina. I'm hot-headed. Sorry to push a generalization, but it's the truth. I'm hot-headed, I'm passionate, I'm spirited. I have no problem, you know, telling people exactly how I feel. And for the longest time, I hated the fact that I look white, right? Because I felt like I was always having to prove my ethnicity. I know more about my culture. I know more about my history. I grew up in DC, so I have a very close affinity to the Black culture. That's how I grew up, you know? And for the longest time, I was just trying to find a place. And now, in my position, I've realized that I can use the way I look, my privilege, to get into these spaces and raise hell. And that's what I'm doing every chance I get. But I feel it my moral obligation to remind people constantly of how privileged they are and remind them, right, that their experiences that are incredibly similar to that of Black and brown communities are the same. The only thing is that they have been convinced since they were children, right, that anyone that does not look like you is the damn boogeyman. Fear them. Stay away from them. They're not like you. And we have to start talking about this. One last thing, you know, I saw, I don't know if it's a commercial, I don't know if it's the Lincoln Project or what, but there was a commercial that went out, and, you know, these commercials are getting better and better against Trump, I guess. But there was this one image that I will have in my mind, right? of these 4 little blonde girls holding up Confederate flags. That's now. I'm like, those babies are my daughter's, my son's age, my youngest ones right now. You know, it's taught. That shit's taught, and it can be untaught. And we need to start to focus and have those conversations. They need to be outright. You know, when we talk about Black people on food stamps, we need to start spewing out the stats on white people on food stamps too. Like, that needs to immediately follow. We need to stop saying the majority of people that receive and benefit from these programs are Black people. And that when white people need them, well, they've also paid into the system. Well, you know what? So have Black people. And the majority of people that live on social programs are employed. They're just underemployed. So they are constantly feeding that system. But people don't want to see things for what they are. Again, it's all about misinformation and framing things so that way people continue to be divided. And the last thing I'm going to say about education. We have a system in this country where no one can go and get a college education for free based on income. Worst part, and this is something that I am going to dedicate some time to, but worst part, FAFSA loans will not cover a state institution. So how are you, a Black or brown student, supposed to fund your education if it's too expensive and you can't even get a loan for it? And these loans are not even, you know, bankruptcy won't even get rid of them. So you're going to get that money back one way or another. Why aren't we funding college educations alone for these students? Like, that is the key out of all of this. You know, if people really have to understand what systemic racism means. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, and I'm, as a Latina, kids in cages, it keeps me up at night for sure. But we can't do anything right until we fix this wrong as a nation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that, Esther.
100% correct.
And I think there's this concept of false consciousness where you have this using race to get the class, like similar classes, to fight against themselves, in the sense that, yeah, there's that, oh, look at those Black people taking this. And it's like, meanwhile, everyone loves Medicare. Medicare is extreme, and everyone's on it. Everyone's parents are on it. And yet right now they're talking about cutting it, which is going to affect everyone. Yet it seems like, you know, some people don't even know their own economic interests anymore. And it is incredibly disturbing.
Yeah, I would say that we have something called like racialized imagery or coded imagery, meaning that when you say the word welfare, people have an immediate image in their mind of what that is, because we've racialized it. But if you ask people, should we increase welfare? And if they are non-African American, they'll say no. But if you say, oh, do you want to increase Social Security benefits? That has not been racialized. Everyone understands that is, everyone benefits from that. And people usually say, yeah, we totally want to fund more Social Security benefits. I think our environment, the reason it's hard to have racial discussions is, one, it is very difficult to get someone to wrap their head around just how literally every system in the United States is designed in such a way that it can harm minorities. Like, from the job applications and your name being too ethnic and being just thrown out, to environmental racism, there are so many ways that it manifests. And I do want to, you know, make a call out. I think that this is not a Democrat and Republican issue, because there are racists in both parties. There are racists running both parties. One party, for me, is a little more palatable because at least they acknowledge racism exists. But liberals need to acknowledge that we got to clean all the houses. Like, you haven't done a great job for minority communities, and neither have the Republicans, because you're both growing up in a context where everything is racialized, and you just You're trained not to really think about your own implicit biases, and that results in policies where you're just perpetuating a cycle of systemic racism. So
and it's subtle.
Yep.
It's subtle. I'll give an example for University of Maryland. I remember growing up from Georges County, going through the public school system. I read Their Eyes Were Watching God, right? I read Souls of Black Folks by W.B. Du Bois, right? The origin of intersectionality, because he had this conversation of being both Black and American. And coming to the University of Maryland, and all my peers were like, what's that? You know what I mean? You haven't read this? And I was like, sure, I'll read that. And then the response was like, oh, that's a Black thing, okay? And it's one of the interesting things, because if you're going to have a conversation about like race and the original question of race and violence in our cities in America, it's the reality of like, if you're a minority in this country, you are born or you move into a system that is racialized. You didn't create it. You're just responding to it. Often you're not the person who even brings up race in any incident in which you're interacting, okay? But you have to respond to these built in, I think to Delisha's point, like, you have this imagery of what something means, right? I just finished reading this book called Stranger in My Own Land. And it's this book about a researcher from Berkeley who went and lived in rural Louisiana for a couple years to really get to understand the mindset of a number of like conservatives who had actually more in common with poor urban folks than they would like to admit, but just wouldn't identify with them, right? And what came up, and this affects social policy, but what came up was this idea that America is this land that has a line, okay? And everyone's in line trying to reach the mountaintop. And the folks who are further up in line are folks who are more well-to-do, but the reason why they're further up in line is because we assume that they've worked harder, okay? That is based on race. Okay, because if you are essentially, if you are white and you look at another person who's further ahead of you and they're white, you can say, well, they must have earned it because they worked hard, because it makes you feel better about your position. Okay, but acknowledging that, like, well, maybe you didn't have any agency to begin with. That is disempowering. Okay, it was very interesting of like the psyche of people who identify as conservative versus liberal, and how we tell our deep stories about ourselves. And they have a big issue because who used to be behind them are all these minorities and all these women and all these gay folks and all, right? And then now, because of social policy changes, all these others appear to be catching up and even surpassing you in line. And that makes you angry, because the government has come in and propelled these people up to where you are in line or further, as opposed to acknowledging that the government and society through policy has intentionally and forcibly held these folks back, right? So now that the government is, I wouldn't even argue that they're not holding them back anymore, but holding them back less than they were before. And you can see people's real ability, and they're leapfrogging other folks. Well, that's problematic now, because it's not really about your ability or how hard you work. I think some of this is about what Evan was talking about before, how, moving past the 70s, this GDP growth, income wasn't, moving the same. And I think what we saw is that this Robert Reich idea of countervailing power. We used to have organized countervailing power to a lot of concentrated power, right? So you have this minority of people who are super rich and powerful, and you have this broader group of people who are a part of the NAACP or League of Women Voters, or they're part of their unions. And they use these organizations to leverage their power into policies okay, that started increased funding in education and allowing women to finally start to enter the workforce and, worker safety and all these things. And once we got away from that, the conversation has increasingly become what? This conversation over arguing over few resources, as opposed to looking at who's really having all of this power. I mean, it's, we look at the golden generation, we idolize them so much, but, in that age, people were getting taxed, 40, 50, 60% of their income for their nation, for the betterment of their children and their community, to take care of their elders, and now we're doing all we can to lower taxes. And, it's like, I get it, but we're also having a real conversation about what are our values as a nation, and what do we really want to accomplish as a people. I for one, think we need to get back to countervailing power and organized power. I think unionization is a component of that. But I also think there's other things we need to do, like Evan was talking about with DOJ and IRS. I think one of the things that changed in the 70s and the 80s is that, CEOs used to have this mindset that their stakeholders weren't just their shareholders. It also was their customers and their employees. We've moved from that. I think we need to move back towards that, and policy can influence that by forcing, if you're going to receive government tax benefits, then you have to have worker representation on your boards or things like that. Keeping employer compensation to some loose relative amount of average worker pay so that you can ensure that workers' wages are going up, because that CEO wants their wage to go up, right? Build some policy self-interest, into this. I think the same thing has happened with wealth. As I think generally Americans are becoming poor because income inequality and wealth inequality is increasing. Now you go into any community, you have single family homes, expensive townhouse communities, or apartments, okay? You used to have large communities of condos or other housing situations that was built up in the Roosevelt era just so that people can get housing, okay? To get people out of like the essential ghettos and the like. I think we need to get really flexible on how we can allow Americans to just build wealth, house themselves. I think healthcare gets into all of that. But, I think we are stuck on this. I would just tell you, I just feel like as a Black man in America, I get so tired about talking about race, because I think sometimes I enter a room and I feel like folks feel like, well, we have to talk about race because there's a Black man in the room, and it's just like, no, this isn't my problem. This is you all's problem that you all think about when you see me, and then I have to respond to. I would happily never have to deal with this problem if I had the capacity, but I don't have a choice in the matter, right? And then with that, if I don't advocate for policy changes based on race, they don't happen, right? So like Maryland, the beginning of COVID was not tracking, positive cases, hospitalizations, and deaths based off of race and gender and the like, until we made a thing about it. And then lo and behold, we found out who was dying the most: Black and brown people, So then we realized, okay, we need to make very interesting policy interventions to make sure that they are getting the help they need. But if you didn't ask that question, you couldn't take care of your people, right? So like, if we are all American people, then that's all that should matter. And these culture wars, I think, is just a waste of time for us actually becoming the nation that we can really become.